According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, head of delegation for Nigeria, the best way to counter long-term impact of protracted armed conflict, violence, and hatred, which can affect whole generations, is to prevent violations of international humanitarian law. At the heart of this lies the protection of civilians, of detainees, of the wounded and sick, and others not participating in hostilities. It is this shared humanity that gives international humanitarian law its relevance, its legitimacy, and its universal sense. We all need to use our power to ensure that war has limits every day in every armed conflict and for everyone, because wars without limits are wars without end. Joining us today to speak on this and the work of the mission to aid victims of war in the Northeast are Vincent Pouget and Aliyu Dawobe.
After which, Dr. Abiodun Pokuola, Associate Professor of Clinical Oncology and Head of Department Radiology and Oncology, LASUCOM and LASUP, will be here to talk about breast cancer treatments at the Lagos State University Teaching Hospital, while Dr. Adeshola Oshin, Public Health Specialist and Founder, Health Images, will teach us the technical know-how of breast self-exams in different local languages. And then Adiola Akisoya of Hope Emerge Foundation will tell us how the organization is increasing access to healthcare for vulnerable groups of people in Nigeria. We'll also review newspaper headlines from across the country and round off with news trending around the world. It's going to be all that and more today on
The Morning Show. Welcome back to the Morning Show here on Arise. Nearly 22,000 Nigerians have been reported missing to the International Committee of the Red Cross during the decade of the conflict in the northeast of Nigeria. The highest number of missing persons registered with the ICRC in any country. Nearly 60% were minors at the time they went missing, meaning thousands of parents don't know where their children are and if they're alive or dead. Joining us now from our Abuja studio to speak on this and the mission's work in Nigeria to end the Northeast crisis are Vincent Pouget and Aliyu Dawobe. But before we come to them, let's take a quick look at the work they do around the world. Good morning, Vincent and Aliyu, and welcome to the show. Thank you for that video. But before we go further, I just want you to give people that might not be familiar with the work that you're doing in the Northeast, or actually with the work of the ICRC. Can you give them just a little bit of an overview of the work you're doing around the world, but specifically the work you're doing in Nigeria?
Thank you. Good morning. The International Committee of the Red Cross is part of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. That is one of the world's largest humanitarian movements. We are present in most of the countries of the world. Our focus within this largest movement is to alleviate the suffering created by armed violence and armed conflict in particular. So that applies with what is happening in the northeast of Nigeria. So what we are doing there is to alleviate the suffering of people immediately affected by the armed conflict by providing them access to healthcare, by providing them food, water to drink, shelters to be protected from the intemperies when they have to live outside their home. Also, what we are doing is to promote better respect for a set of rules called the International Humanitarian Law that do try to prevent violation affected people not taking part into the conflict, be they civilians, be they health workers, detainees, that must be protected by the parties to the conflict. So we are working on promoting, engaging with the various stakeholders to have this set of law better respected also in the Northeast.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank you for the work that you do. I imagine it must be a vocation. It must be a very difficult job to do. So thank you very much. I'd like to start there. But we heard the really heartbreaking statistics that Nigeria has recorded the highest number of registered missing people with the ICRC. And it's so sad that it has come to this in Nigeria in the past 10 years. Even in that video that we just played, we had names of different conflict zones all over the world. I never imagined that Nigeria would be on such a list. And now we're breaking the worst kind of record. And that 60% of the missing were children at the time that they went missing. Can you talk us through your work with reuniting families? How do you go about doing that? And what are your plans to reduce this number of 22,000 people, staggering amounts of people who are missing?
Thank you very much for these questions and for having us in your studios. Like we mentioned earlier, around 22,000 figures of people coming to the ICRC requesting to be reunited with their families is actually something very big we have seen across the world. So now, reuniting people with their families is actually very, very daunting task. Usually you have, like you mentioned in the report, over 60% of these people are children. So children simply means that people may not be able to remember the telephone numbers of their loved ones. So it's really very, very difficult. It's a daunting task. Sometimes it takes months, even years, to be able to reunite a family member. This very big figure was generated over the years. We've been doing our best, working very closely with the Nigerian Red Cross Society to be able to reunite these families. In the northeast of Nigeria, we have a lot of, a lot of work that we do, working closely with the Nigerian Red Cross, bicycling to villages to be able to get addresses of people that have been given to us. Sometimes addresses are not really accurate, so we have to go around to see how we would be able to trace this family members. So it's, like I mentioned, it's really a very big job given to us. We are doing this. We were able to reunite a number of them, but then we still have a lot of work to do to reunite more.
Thank you for that, Aliyu. As you're explaining the work you're doing to help reunite families, can you also give our viewers just a sense of how this actually happens? How do families get separated, and how has that been happening throughout this conflict? I'm sure viewers want to know how parents and children actually get separated during this conflict, and where have you been able to find the people that you have been able to reunite?
So the reason of the disappearance of these people can be variety of reasons, but most of it, 99% of this caseload is linked with the armed conflict in the northeast in Nigeria. So people may got missing because they have been arrested, because they have been abducted, or just because they fled to another place where they lost contact with their family members because they had to flee in the rush. Some people may be dead somewhere and their families are not aware of it. So there may be a variety of reasons that can explain why people don't have any more contact with their family members. And it's especially challenging for children, as was mentioned with my colleague, because they may not be able to explain clearly where do they come from and to give you a contact number, phone number for their parents. One of the main challenges we face in reuniting these family members is access. Access in the Northeast explains a lot about this big caseload because there's a lot of places where access is very limited, unfortunately, to the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Nigerian Red Cross Society. But we are doing that also using our network within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement that goes beyond Nigeria. Some people have fled Nigeria and have relocated in Chad, for instance, or Cameroon. And there we have some ICRC presence, but also some partner presence, the National Red Cross Societies. I mean, we have the Cameroonian Red Cross Societies, the Chadian Red Cross Societies. And we work together with them to reunite family members. And just recently, we reunited some 5 children coming from Chad back to Nigeria. Thanks to this network and this long-term effort.
That's wonderful news. And I wish you many more successes in that area. But I want to ask you now about security. That is a huge concern for aid workers such as yourself. How do you feel about the levels of security that are provided for you right now? And also the climate of mistrust between the military and one particular international NGO, which the Nigerian military have accused of aiding and abetting Boko Haram. That is nothing to do with the ICRC, but does this kind of climate affect the work that you do?
Access in the Northeast is a day-to-day challenge. There is a number of security limitations due to the conflict itself, that the unpredictability also of the conflict. And not so long ago, just last year, I mean, 2 of our staff members got kidnapped and then killed in this conflict. So on a daily basis, we reassess the security situation to see how much we can have access. Our aim is to engage with all parties. Our intent of what we do worldwide is to engage with all parties, all stakeholders, to ensure safe access to the victims. To assess the situation of access in the Northeast, I would say it's challenging. It has been challenging for long, and in many places of the world where there's an armed conflict happening, it's challenging. The peculiarity maybe in the Northeast is that you're in a situation where the conflict has been dragging on for very long. We call it protracted armed conflict.
Right at this point,
it's a place where
we've got to take a short break, but we'll be back to talk about the peculiarities of your operations in the Northeast with regarding access and security. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Just before the break, Vincent Pouget and Aliyu Dawobe were talking to us about the peculiarities faced by the ICRCs in their operation in the Northeast of Nigeria. Please continue.
Thank you. So in the northeast of Nigeria, the situation is a bit peculiar compared with other places because the conflict has been dragging on for long. People have gone through amazing suffering due to the armed conflict. So the society is highly polarized. Either you are with one side of the conflict or you are with the other side of the conflict. So when a humanitarian actor come and say we are neither with one side or another side of the conflict, we are with the victims, we are neutral, it's hard for people to believe it. But that's the reality of our work. I mean, so that's why also we have a communication team in my degree in Abuja just to keep explaining how we work and that our intent is just to access the victims affected by armed violence, to provide them with assistance and to alleviate the suffering and prevent the suffering of the people by reminding all stakeholders of the basic set of rules linked with international humanitarian law. They all have to respect to spare civilians.
Wow. Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question about the nature of your work and how it's changed. The ICRC is known for emergent, so sort of coming in for short stints, but now you've had to be in a place now for such a prolonged period of time. Tell us a little bit about how the nature of your work has changed in responding to this very prolonged armed conflict.
It's also a situation we're facing in a number of places in the world, but Nigeria is one of these cases where the conflict has been dragging for so long. Donors may kind of have a tendency to be fatigued about sponsoring and financing the response to this conflict. At the same time, the needs are there. I mean, the needs are still huge. I mean, since the beginning of the year, over 80,000 people have been newly displaced. And in total, in the Northeast, you have more than 1.4 million people displaced only in Borno State. So that means that more needs to be done and more people need to be involved to find solutions for the people affected by the armed conflict. That's what ICRC is trying to do. We don't want people to depend on humanitarian assistance for ad eternum. I mean, we want them to build up their resilience, and we're supporting that. We want to find sustainable and long-term solutions for the people. One example in Maiduguri has been the building of one provision water facility called Alamduri that is now providing water to over 100,000 people in town, including a few thousand that were recently displaced and located in Stadium Camp. This facility, the Alamduri Water Project Scheme, is going to last for long, and this is a partnership with the authorities, where the authorities basically build up the pipes and the ICRC build up the drillings and to make the system functional. Another example of our interest and how keen we are to engage with other actors is our engagement with the private sectors. There, once again, the ICRC has been, in a way, one of the pioneer organizations to partner with one key strategic private actor here, the Tony Elumelu Foundation. Last year, we sponsored over 200 scholarships for young entrepreneurs coming from areas affected by the armed violence to develop their own skills. So we are giving them seed money, as Tony Elumelu is doing for other entrepreneurs. And the Tony Elumelu Foundation is providing with adequate coaching to help them scale up their business. For us, that's especially critical because when you go to the Northeast, when you talk to the people, I mean, what keeps coming up is they want dignity, they want respect. They don't want to be dependent of humanitarian aid. They rather want to earn by themselves their means of living. So we think that private investment is more than ever needed in this fragile context. ICRC is working on that also, and we launched in 2017 one innovative funding system called the Humanitarian Impact Bond. That is now financing 3 physical rehabilitation programs in the world, one in Mali, one in DRC, and one in northern Nigeria, where basically it's innovative system in the sense that private investors give initial money to the ICRC to start the program. After a 5-year period, there is an independent review of how performant has been this program, how useful has it been to the people, and then depending on the result, the private investors will get either the same amount of money they invested or more money if the performance is beyond expectations. And this money will be given by a few states that are sponsoring the program.
Follow-up questions. I wanted to make sure I heard you right when you said 4.1 million people are displaced in Borno State. Can you just confirm that that's what I heard?
Could you repeat that question again?
I said I wanted to confirm if the number I heard was right when you said 4.1 million people are displaced in Borno State. Is that correct?
Estimate is 1.4 million people in Borno State, and in the Northeast we are talking about 2 million people that have been internally displaced people.
Okay. And then, Aliyu, I wanted to just ask you specifically, Vincent had mentioned the program you're doing with the Tony Elumelu program. As you have this opportunity now for both of you to talk about how more corporations and more partners can get involved, And what would you like to see more Nigerian organizations doing with the Red Cross, especially since you have this program you've already started with the Tony Elumelu Foundation?
Before I go to this, just to mention of the peculiarity of the conflict in the northeast of Nigeria. I have had situations where I was able to meet with people who have been displaced severally. People, you know, the northeast of Nigeria is a place where you have people with polygamous families. So people have been displaced several times, moving from one place to the other. So it's really very, very, very serious on them. And the need for resilience, like Vincent mentioned, is very, very possible for us to keep moving, to try to see how we can make them resilient and be on their own for much more. For the Tony Elumelu Foundation, I think Vincent will talk much more about that. But I still will have to talk mainly about these people being displaced to places and moving overnights, trying to get to some safe places, and then these safe places, they also get displaced again, and so on and so on. Finally finding themselves perhaps like in Maiduguri or Yola, and then the humanitarian actors come to try to see how they can give assistance. The assistance are ranging from so many other things, from food, water, and latrines, of course, to be given to them. Like we also mentioned earlier on, displacements of people happened. And when it happens, a lot of people first look for safety themselves. And by the time they get safe, then they try to look for their loved ones. And then they don't see these loved ones, and reuniting is very difficult. If you look at the Lake Chad region and where this crisis is happening, it's easy for people to jump over to other countries and very difficult to reunite. So this is something that is really very serious for us to look at and to try to see not only the ICRC, but also media organizations to try to put effort in trying to see that we are able to reunite these families with their loved ones. Vincent?
So talking about private partnership, you mentioned actors and private sector partnership. Just 2 weeks ago, we had an event organized in Lagos with the Lagos Chamber of Commerce, where you had about 80 businessmen and businesswomen from Lagos attending the event. That was hosted by our president, the International Committee of the Red Cross president that came on visit to Nigeria. And as a guest of honor, we had also Tony Elumelu. So it was just to share the experience of what we have done so far, and just to invite other business actors, to take steps, to invest more in these basic infrastructures in fragile contexts like you have in the Northeast, because that's critical. Just to highlight one of the challenges of this, for sure, investors are kind of reluctant to invest in a situation where the context is highly fragile. That's where we insist that some actors, including state actors, have a key role to play to de-risk the investment in such area. And one way to do that is by increasing the respect of international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law, in a way, is the first line of defense for basic rule of order that will prompt more investment in such places.
Thank you, Vincent. Aliyu, I wanted to talk to you about the farmer herder crisis, which I'm aware that the ICRC has been involved in trying to offer relief and support. Because when we talk about the crisis in Nigeria and the Northeast and the North in general, people think of the Boko Haram insurgency, but this is another very important issue. Can you tell us what the Red Cross has done in that regard and what areas that you're active in?
Okay, just like we are working in the northeast of Nigeria, we are also working in the north central states where we have this herder farmer crisis going on. It's the same scenario that we work in these areas, and we have our programs going on. Other situations are not as bad as possibly they are in the northeast of Nigeria, because people don't go far away. It's easily for them to get reunited with their families. But the programs are mostly the same, where we have support in terms of access to food, access to water, hand pumps, water provision and temporary and permanent shelter. Usually we provide permanent shelter to people, like in Kaduna State. Specifically, we have supported people with permanent shelter. Also in Benue State, people have been given support in terms of roofing sheets, tools for them to be able to bring back their houses that they have lost. We have also had programs that have to do with vaccination programs to livestock, where herders are also supported in terms of vaccinating their livestock, and also training what we call community animal health workers to be able to continue, because when this crisis happens, most of the facilities are broken down. The health system of both the humans and the animals are affected. Either veterinarians are afraid to go and vaccinate livestock or give them support, or the herders are also afraid to be able to have access to this. So we try to bridge this gap to be able to have them access these facilities. This we've been doing in the north central states, and also in the northeast we are planning to do same, because there are livestock there and definitely they are also affected. So this is what we are doing. And we try, like Vincent mentioned earlier on, to get in touch with all the actors of this crisis to be able to inform them.
We've got to take a short break at this point, but we'll be back with more on the activities of the ICRC. Please stay with us.
Welcome back to the morning show. We're still talking about the Northeast crisis with Vincent Pouget and Aliyu Dawobe in our Abuja studios. One of the things you had provided for us was actually a little video on the rules of war. We want to take a look at that and then have a conversation with you about that and how you're navigating the peculiarities of this Nigerian situation. Let's take a look.
Since the beginning, humans have resorted to violence as a way to settle disagreements. Yet through the ages, people from around the world have tried to limit the brutality of war. It was this humanitarian spirit that led to the first Geneva Convention of 1864 and to the birth of modern international humanitarian law. Setting the basic limits on how wars can be fought, these universal laws of war protect those not fighting, as well as those no longer able to. To do this, a distinction must always be made between who or what may be attacked and who or what must be spared and protected. Most importantly, civilians can never be targeted. To do so is a war crime.
When they drove into our village, they shouted that they were going to kill everyone. I was so scared. I ran to hide in the bush. I heard my mother screaming. I thought I would never see her again.
Every possible care must be taken to avoid harming civilians or destroying things essential for their survival. They have a right to receive the help they need.
The conditions prisoners lived in never used to bother me. People like him were the reason my brother was dead. He was the enemy and was nothing to me. But then I realized that behind bars, he was out of action and no longer a threat to me and my family.
The laws of war prohibit torture and other ill treatment of detainees, whatever their past. They must be given food and water and allowed to communicate with loved ones. This preserves their dignity and keeps them alive. Medical workers save lives, sometimes in the most dangerous conditions.
Fighters from both sides were wounded in a dead battle. We were taking them to the nearest hospital. At a checkpoint, a soldier threatened us to treat his men only. We were running out of time, and I was afraid that now all of them were going to die.
Medical workers must always be allowed to do their job, and the Red Cross or Red Crescent must not be attacked. The sick or wounded have a right to be cared for, regardless of whose side they are on. Advances in weapons technology have meant that the rules of war have also had to adapt. Because some weapons and methods of warfare don't distinguish between fighters and civilians, limits on their use have been agreed. In the future, wars may be fought with fully autonomous robots. But will such robots ever have the ability to distinguish between a military target and someone who must never be attacked? No matter how sophisticated weapons become, it is essential that they are in line with the rules of war. International humanitarian law is all about making choices that preserve a minimum of human dignity in times of war and make sure that living together again is possible once the last bullet has been shot.
Wow. If only we could all be pacifists, quite frankly. That's such a sobering video. But thank you for sharing it. Gentlemen, I wanted to talk to you about that video on the rules of war. We had mentioned earlier, well, you had, Vincent, about the need for that legal framework, the international humanitarian law, and also the need for nations and warring factions to adhere to conventions like the Geneva Convention and what have you. But I want to talk to you about the policy of impartiality that the ICRC implements. That, for me, is one of the most striking features of your work. You've touched on that earlier, but can you expand on that? How do you actually manage to implement that? Because it must be very difficult to, where the lines are blurred. We saw in that video the rights of detainees, how paramount they are. But some of these people have done heinous, ugly things. So can you just take us through that a bit?
And just to mention also that for people who want to engage with more and know more about our operation in Nigeria, we have launched recently a Facebook page, ICRC in Nigeria. So I encourage people just to come and engage with us to know more about international humanitarian law and our operation in Nigeria. On your specific question about impartiality, it starts from a very simple principle. I mean, when violence happens, armed violence happens in a community, there's a lot of people affected. You mentioned actors cannot cope with all the problems and all the people affected. So we have to make some choices. Our choices are made on simple principle. What are the most urgent needs? What are the people the most at need? So that's where most of our action is directed to people that have fled their home, IDPs, internally displaced people. Because from one day to another, in a rush, they have to leave their home because of the armed violence. They lose everything. They don't have anything to leave. So we give them some essential household items, food, water, and shelter. But that's also why we are focusing on some other categories of people, like detainees. Because detainees, I mean, especially in the midst of armed conflict, are not sometimes the top priority of the authorities. So that's why ICRC is keen on visiting them and ensuring a minimum respect for their dignity in detention according to the international Mandela rules, for example. So we identify these kind of categories of people where we think they are most at risk of problem and they are more affected than others. Like also women and children, when we do reunite people, the people we reunite first are children, because you can imagine a child that has been separated from his family members in a situation of armed conflict is more exposed to adverse situation, to risk than an adult. So we have to make choice, and that's what we call our impartiality principle. We look at the most urgent needs, and then the people the most vulnerable.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a question about your teams and your staff members. as sort of you look at the global world and the nature of armed conflict is changing, sometimes much more prolonged than normal. Last week was International Mental Health Awareness. I wonder, how are you building? I mean, you're working with victims to build resiliency. How are you changing the way you work with your teams and build resiliency among people that the nature of their work has dramatically changed over the last 10 years?
Yeah, thank you very much. Last week, like you mentioned, was World Mental Health Day. When conflict happens, you have a lot of people affected. The traditional way of people looking at things is mainly to give people food, water, shelter, and the rest of them. A lot of people tend to forget that people have lost everything. They have lost their loved ones, and this trauma in them is still very, very serious on them. So ICRC presently has programs targeting people that have been affected and people that are mentally affected because they have lost everything. They will have to start from the scratch. So the program is targeting these type of people, and then volunteers from the Nigerian Red Cross are trained to train them. First, to get them on board, to be able to make them understand that it's not only them. There are other people who can share experiences of what happens to them. This alone will be able to help them douse their tension on their trauma that they are passing through. And then we have our technical people who help them in advice, in technical way of trying to see how they can solve their problems health-wise. So this is actually a key program that we are doing, and we are actually moving away from the traditional way of doing things, but trying to improve ways. This is based on assessment we do to people, sitting down with them, direct assessment with people, engaging with them, understanding their basic needs, and be able to identify programs to be able to target these needs they are having.
Thank you. I actually was asking more about you, Aliyu and Vincent, because and other staff members in which security has become paramount in the work you do. How does the ICRC work with you and other people like you that actually work for the organization to build resiliency and also help you? Because your work has changed, the nature of your work has changed. And the risk is also changing on a daily basis.
ICRC is a fast evolving institution, trying to accommodate also new changes in the world. And the partnership with the private sector is something we started recently for the International Committee of the Red Cross, because we think that's one way to go. When you look at the world today, you mentioned sector has less and less fund available because there's an economic crisis in the world also. So we have to find ways that go beyond traditional means to better cope with the situation, and at the same time to alleviate suffering of the people affected. Digital transformation is also a key vector we are looking at. That's why I mentioned we just launched our Facebook page in Nigeria. That's a way to engage with people, to build proximity with people, that and in a way to cope with access issue we may have in some places. Because once again, I mean, all our action is based on acceptance of communities and all stakeholders. If we lack this acceptance, we cannot have access to the victim. We cannot provide them with assistance. We cannot provide them with protection. So the bare minimum for us is to be accepted by the communities, what is always a challenge in protracted armed conflict as we are seeing in the Northeast.
Well, thank you both so much for spending time with us this morning. We look forward to and once again, just thank you so much for the work you're doing in Nigeria. We look forward to talking to you some more.